You are listening to the Casting Shadows podcast. This episode will feature kind of an expansion on or explanation of, clarification of concepts which have been discussed in some earlier episodes, but primarily it is the promised follow-up episode to Che Webster's call on our previous episode, but more on that later. The material for this episode is largely drawn from calls or more personal messages or interactions or whatnot that I've had on these topics or in relation to these recent episodes and conversations. So I hope that you will enjoy it. I hope that it sparks some responses in you and that you will then reach out and contact me. But either way, here we go. We're going to talk about layers and frames and the semantics and perception and bias and all of that stuff. We will talk about practical use for conceptualizing your play in this way. And maybe we'll have a call-in or two.
Hey Anthony, Jason here. Just listened to your discussion with Che Webster on your show. Great episode. Really enjoyed it. I look forward to the follow-up episode that you've promised. And I just want to thank you for continuing to put out excellent content and thought-provoking content, really. So, great job. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for the call, Jason. And of course, I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast is well aware that was Jason Connerly of the Nerds RPG Variety Cast. Well, I hope Jason was careful for what he wished for, because now, in this episode, he's going to get it. Welcome to the Casting Shadows podcast. This is not exactly one of Runeslinger's reflections from the road as rain rushes across the roadway, rampantly ravishing the countryside. But it's not exactly not one of those things either. This is really a response to Roleplay Rescue's recent call-in to the show to talk about the layers of play episode. So Che Webster called in. You can hear his call at the beginning of the previous episode on the experience of playing RPGs, which was a conversation between myself and the host of Roleplay Rescue, Che Webster. So in that episode, I promised a specific kind of addressing or further explanation of what I had been talking about and a response to his specific points. So we will take a moment to start with that, the addressing of the points raised by Che. So we were exploring, enjoyably I hope, the different nuances of the terms chosen, the semantics of the terms we chose. And I had explained my reaction, so my preference and my bias informing my reaction to a specific term, that of frame. Now, because I was able to have a conversation with Che, and because he was willing to listen charitably, as my friend Aloy puts it, and because I got lucky and was able to listen charitably as well, we were able to talk using these terms without needing to defend or explain or try to persuade the other to use them. We could just use them in the moment, which was great. So when he explained his reaction to the use of the word frame, right, that role-playing games by their nature, according to this researcher by the name of Gary Allen Fine, that there would be a player frame, which includes all the things that are involving you as yourself. There will be a rules frame, which involves interacting with the mechanisms of play, and there will be a character frame where we're focusing specifically on what's going on in the imagined environment and in the imagined situations of play, right? We can totally see how this is applicable to role-playing games, to a large number of role-playing games. And since 1983, when that research was done and published, there has been an expansion to role-playing games, which kind of pushes it in different areas, out of that precise limitation. And that begs the question, are we also pushing things out into a different type of game, away from role-playing game and into some other kind of related game? This response is not going to deal with that, but this notion of these three frames is a very good one. It's quite sound, and we can be very positive about the notion and yet still feel a twinge, right? Some kind of sensitivity to the nuance of the word chosen, the word frame. Now, Che took the time to explain to me how he perceived the word frame, not as a box, right? Not as an immutable limitation on a thing, but rather as a window frame. And I really find this explanation appealing. And as he was explaining that, he was talking about his reaction to my use of the word layers, and how his reaction to the nuances of that was exactly the same as my reaction to the nuances of the term frame.
For me, the frame stuff is really useful. Whereas you think of a frame, you seem to be talking about a frame being something that's sort of static, as in like the picture frame. I think more of the window frame, and I imagine there being sort of three windows that you could look out of. And for me, this matches with cognitive psychology, because basically whatever we direct our attention to, that is what we experience. And obviously we can switch our attention from one thing to another thing, and we can even do it very, very quickly. And we have this sort of sense of it can become so practiced, as you pointed out, that actually we don't even seem to really notice it. But actually, cognitively, and what's happening with our brain, it's been pretty substantively proven that it actually lowers our overall cognitive ability if we're switching a lot. And so to me, why would I want to stare? I want to stare out the window which has my character in the world. In fact, I want to stare out the window as my character looking out on that world. And I don't want to spend too much time looking through the rules window, or even the us around the table window. And I certainly don't want to be bobbing between them at high speed. So that was kind of where I come from with it, really.
And in that explanation, he talked about a layer cake, which I thought was amazing, because that's exactly where my use of layers came from. We have many different layers that go into the construction of one singular object, and the nuance or the particular thread or the particular strength of the term for layers for me came from this, that each layer can be observed, we can identify it, we can dig into the cake and expose it and say this is a layer, right? Or this layer is about that. Or we can simply look at the entire collection of layers as one thing, as a cake. And so in the episode where I get into discussion of martial arts and how when we relearn how to move, when we learn different ways to organize our responses, when we train particular reactions to particular stimuli, right? When we talk about different combinations, or we learn to drill movement in a way that we can't even conceive of when we begin training. And over time, to have those discrete motions of step here, breathe this way, strike there, extend your senses, be aware of more than just, what you see in the moment. And then drill that alone, drill that in forms, drill that in sparring, over and over and over again until it stops being all of these different components and it becomes one thing. This is why I chose layers, which does not in any way detract from or invalidate the automatic and totally understandable reaction to it that a layer is a separate thing. You can pile them on top of each other, you can dig through them, whatever, but they're obviously separate. And we would have to move from one state or from one layer to another in exactly the same way as we move from one stance to another or from one frame to another and so on. And we would have to pay a switching cost, right? Every time I have to readjust my expectations, stop being focused on player information for a moment and start being focused on character information. Stop making a rule decision, stop making a player decision, and start making a decision in the context of my character. Every time I move between these different frames, or every time I pay attention to one of these different layers, it requires some kind of minor or major mental processing, which takes its toll. Why I ended up going with layers instead of frames in my own way of thinking about it is that I noticed over time that the layers and the particular layers that you wish to pay more attention to can indeed become a cake and coexist as one thing, and maybe remove, but definitely reduce the switching cost. And so one example of that I have, which came out in our conversation, is when the dice become an analog for the action in the imagined situation. When climbing the wall, when coding the computer, when striking a blow, when these become represented, the action of the motions is the action of rolling the dice, where this becomes a more immersive or a more engaging property than a disruptive one. And I think that's what I have to say about that at this moment. Not as a refutation, not to dispute, but to continue to share and explain. As an addendum, it is, of course, currently impossible to show the inner workings of a person's mind, to show their reactions, other than as, some sort of graphical display of activity going on. So far as I know, we can't currently record and show visual information for a person's dreams or imaginings. However, I did have a very immersive, in-character, as-character experience playing a game that was being recorded for the YouTube channel. It was a really intense experience. And so I went through that recording I don't know what I was expecting to find, really, but it was quite disappointing from the perspective of how that experience had felt. And that made it a little, not totally, but a little easier for me to accept the contentious attitude that sometimes comes in from people who have not or do not believe in any kind of immersive or in-character experience, whose sole experience in playing role-playing games is devoid of that in-character as character experience. They simply make decisions as themselves about the character from a distance, right? Whether that means they're operating on the player layer, making a decision about one or more characters, like an author or a director might as they are working through a script, from nothing to an idea about action. Oh, what if the character does this, they think to themselves, and yeah, that might be fun, and so they do it, rather than the very visceral, real, and connected, I'm doing this because it makes sense, because you understand the perspective of the character and you have merged with it. You have learned how to stop thinking about it and just do it. So, watching myself having a very immersive experience and have it look like nothing was happening was a very eye-opening and instructive experience. And so I annotated the living hell out of that video to explain what was going on in my inner life. You can find that video in the All-for-One Régime Diabolique actual playlist, and I will link it in the show notes, and you can watch it for yourself. It's not one that you can really listen to. I mean, it's an interesting episode, I think. The Game Master is very talented, and what made this experience possible, even though we were playing online, was that he knows the game system really well. I know the game system really well. We know the characters inside and out because we've been playing them for years. We've been talking about them for years, in and out of game situations. We love the setting. We grew up reading The Three Musketeers, watching the movies, and it's a part of us in a very visceral sense. So even though there was a high cost to play, being at a strange hour of the day, being recorded, happening online, so we're separated by a variety of things, it still managed to be incredibly immersive. And by that I mean there are moments where I am having strong visual imagination of the environment around my character, as though seeing it as though I were really there. And I don't mean hallucinating. I don't mean losing track of the fact that I'm sitting in a chair. I mean that the Game Master and I, playing the game together, produced sufficient stimulus and engagement in me that my imagination of the situation was so strong I could visually imagine it rather than conceive of the idea of it. And there's the usual engagement experience of losing track of time and of having what some people like to call bleed from the emotional state of the character into my own real state, right? That sense of excitement, the sense of activation when danger is near, the sense of anger and the need for revenge and all that stuff that makes up a good sword fighting kind of experience. So if you'd like to watch that, you can. Like I said, I'll put the link in it. And read along with the annotations and see what you think. And if you have any feedback about it, sharing your own experiences about immersion, about engagement, about the union of the player and their understanding of the character in an in-character, as-character experience, then I would really, really like to hear them. Okay, so that's my example, kind of what I'm talking about. It can be very hard to believe that this type of reaction can be real, and that's okay. And it can be problematic when people who, like me, have this experience and claim it as the only source of immersion, because that's just as ludicrous as saying that this experience doesn't exist. Right? Engagement and immersion in an activity is very well documented, and we've all experienced it doing multiple things throughout our lives, and we're engaging in completely different activities when we experience it. So we can kind of lighten up on that point and let it go. Anyway, on to the next segment. So, in practical terms, in actual terms, in play terms, how could this talk of layers or frames matter in any substantive way? And unlike other theory, the way that I think about this is for play rather than for game design, although it's relevant in that direction too, I suppose, but it's not something that I really consider. But what we're talking about is with these different layers. I'm going to keep using the term until I can comfortably shift out of it. And I'll be able to comfortably shift out of using the term by using it and annoying myself. So bear with me and wait for the inevitable transition to a new word. But let's say we have the character layer. What is this good for? Well, when I do something as a player or as a game master, what effect do I expect it to have? What do I want to affect? Right? So by working on the character layer, I'm going to restrict myself. I'm going to be able to consciously restrict myself to things that matter to the character. If I'm actually aware that there is one, if I'm aware that there is a way to play, such as in character as character, which is where the player is dependent on me to provide the type of information that will inform their imagination and work with them and not against them, and not ask them to do things that will push them away from that imagined stance inside the character. Right? How do I do that if I'm unaware of how what I say matters, and the way that I say it, and what I ask for? Right? When I ask for a roll, was it necessary, or am I just doing that to make a moment have a different feeling? Because everyone says, oh, rolls produce tension, which is another thing I don't exactly agree with. But the potential to roll certainly brings in some excitement, right? And people like rolling dice, so we want to have moments of rolling dice. But this is all happening on the player layer, on the social layer. I could, without a lot of thought, recognize that feeling of enjoying to roll the dice and wanting to give that feeling to other people, and so asking for a roll of the dice, either as a player or as the game master, right? Can I roll for this? That's going to be really exciting to see what happens when the dice stop moving. Or roll for that to see if you succeed. And we are enjoying that moment. But that innocent and fun act might interfere with someone's enjoyment of an in-character moment. Not always, but can. Remember, we're just talking about things that we can consider. So I'd like to put forward 2 examples. The first example will be of Call of Cthulhu, right? And we'll take a look at 2 ways to approach a character losing their mind because of cosmic horror. The second example will be to look at combat in a pulp heroics game. So let's start with Call of Cthulhu and the idea of sanity. Now, we're not going to operate on the rules layer. We're not going to actually change any rules. Sanity will work the way that sanity has always worked in Call of Cthulhu. What we're going to talk about is procedure or method, right? Your approach to employing the rules, because you're making a consideration about the in-character as character experience. You don't have to make this consideration if we're talking about in-character as observer play, or weirdly, in-character as player, right? But we do have to make some kind of adjustment if we are trying to maximize the experience or enjoyment for in-character as character play. Okay, so imagine that the situation that has arisen in play involves a series of shocks to the character such that, according to the rules of the game, sanity rolls will need to be made, and there's a good chance that sanity will be depleted. I think it's fair to say that under normal play, as these shocks are introduced, a lot of the weight of this experience will be transmitted to the player by the game master, the keeper of arcane lore, asking for sanity rolls, right? And people will lean in and look for the reaction as the player rolls their percentile dice and determines whether or not they weathered that particular shock. And they will announce, right? And then we'll check on failures for how many sanity points were lost, and we'll keep track of the total number of sanity points were lost until, we wait for some sort of episode as caused by the game in relation to this depletion of sanity. Okay? So that's the rules layer of this situation. A series of rolls wherein points of sanity are lost, moving toward some sort of sanity-based effect according to the rules of the game. So, what if, as Che Webster talks about on Roleplay Rescue, what if this were handled entirely by the game master? What would be different? For one thing, the game master doesn't have to switch between layers of spoken interaction. He doesn't have to switch, or she doesn't have to switch from description of what is seen, smelled, touched, tasted, right, sensed, heard, any of those things, to then say, okay, roll, and then back in. There doesn't have to be any switching of state or switching of intention for the communication between the two players, the keeper and the player of the investigator. The dice are rolled ostensibly behind a screen or out of sight, and the description flows accordingly. So I'd like to say that again. In normal play, where the player rolls the dice, not only do they know that they have passed or failed a sanity check, they know how many points of sanity they have lost, they know how close they are to experiencing some kind of change in their character's behavior, and there is a whole aspect of the rules that is very present and is governing how they behave. Right? So we might see more cautious play arise as the player recognizes the threat, to their characters, mental calm, and chooses to shy away from it. There are other players who find this situation to be exciting, interesting, or hilarious, which is a pretty common reaction, and so they just keep on keeping on with what they were doing, looking forward to the moment when the character experiences an episode, a breakdown of some kind. Right? So what decision the player makes is informed by their preference. Their ability to make it is informed by the rules and their awareness of the current condition of the character as indicated by play. It's a pretty normal way to play, right? We're not describing anything strange. But what if the player is allowed to experience nothing except for their character's perception of the situation? So that, in a real sense, the keeper is allowed to experiment with the tool of being an unreliable narrator. Right? The character may have experienced some sort of break. They might be experiencing some sort of delusion. They might be paranoid now, right? As the result of the machinations of a cult in the background. They might be developing a hyper-focused traumatic reaction to this series of shocks and horrors that they've been through, and their body is telling them they have got to get out of here. They have got to get to a safe place. They've got to get away from all of this. And rather than make that an external or meta level or player decision about what's going on, instead the environment is described as if that were objectively true, right? A very different opportunity is then presented. The player gets to experience the inside of the condition as dictated by the game without having to acknowledge the rules layer that a condition has been applied. Right? They can continue as if, from their character's perspective, they have remained the same and the environment has become more threatening, and they're responding to the real threat of the environment. So they may perceive that they are being stalked by cultists everywhere. Every glance, every look, every shrug, every gesture is laden with menace. Whereas they might simply be walking down a street and strangers are looking at them to assess whether or not they need to step out of the way or not, or how much space is between them on the sidewalk, and that sort of thing. It's a very different approach. Now, this approach might not appeal to you, but we're not really talking about preference here. We're simply talking about methodology and the effect of a methodology on play. This decision to describe things rather than operate with the rules layer and the description layer being exposed equally, we cover over the rules layer for the benefit of the in-character experience. It's not about doing things like denying agency or feeding the player false information. We're feeding them their understanding of the world as their character would perceive it according to the rules of the game. Right? Now, this isn't easy. We need to have an understanding of how to describe the environment in such a way as to produce the desired and enjoyable effect from a, enjoying this type of scenario perspective. But also, what if there is more than one player, and what if conditions vary between them? How do we handle the distribution of varied knowledge, and on whose shoulders does this rest? Do we rely on the characters or the players to handle the meta knowledge between their characters. You might say, well, it might make the whole thing moot. If I know that the player to my left is getting a different description or different details than the player to my right compared to me, well, then I know something's going on, to which can be returned. Well, as we learn to play with this tool, we can kind of see that as, our recognition that something isn't quite right with the people that we're walking with. And this applies to all three of the characters. The one who has had sort of break from, quote, reality, end quote, and the other two who are at different levels of strain and stress. And we all start looking at each other a little differently for different reasons. And so we can play on this awareness that, what player 1 was told is different from what player 2 was told, and player 3 was, given slightly more information than the other two, but, that kind of stuff. So we know that there's something going on, and this allows us to interact with each other, which is a huge part of the role-playing experience. And so, this initial weakness, this initial awkwardness can be practiced into a benefit if we choose. Now, there's other things that we can do, of course. We can remove people from the room and have the game master running back and forth, and we can be passing notes. We can be doing all kinds of things to address this in whatever way suits us. But the point is, when we become aware of the different things that people want to get out of a game, we can become aware of different ways to do it. And this is just one example, kind of an extreme and exaggerated example to, expose the point, if that makes sense. So let's look at the second example. The second example is pulp heroics. Right? Now, I really like systems like Mithras, which has detailed hit location effects when exposed to damage, and a whole variety of ways to inflict unthinkable harm upon your fellow human beings and other creatures and critters. And this is exactly what I'm looking for, unless I'm playing within the confines, within the enjoyable boundaries of a particular type of genre. So if we were to do something like Doc Savage and the Shadow and the Spider, lots of gunplay, hyper-intelligent villains with super science, and lots of fisticuffs and death traps and daring escapes, injury is interesting and fun, and avoiding injury is interesting and fun, and having various levels of capability between, the boss, their close henchmen, and then all the mooks, and compared to the, kind of overpowered or superpowered or exceptional heroic characters of the pulp heroics genre. All that's very fun. What is a problem, because it breaks our expectations for the genre, is when, somebody gets a broken ankle, and it will be weeks before they have healed. This is not to say that this didn't appear in the pulps, but it, in those cases, is the entirety of the story. Right? The hero has this condition, and what do they do as a result of it? And in a role-playing sense, not all of us play with story, and in a role-playing sense, not all of us choose to set up situations like that. Lots of us will tend to say, okay, so we open with the plane on fire and heading down towards the mountain. The engine has exploded. There's a corpse next to you, and you're locked in a struggle with an assassin. You're both wrestling for control of the gun in the open door of the plane as the plane is screaming down on fire toward the mountain. Lots of people will start a pulp adventure game that way. What do you do? But I think it's quite different to say, okay, well, now you've got a shattered knee, and it's going to be weeks and weeks and weeks of extensive rehabilitation. Your character cannot walk and has a variety of situational modifiers because of the pain. What do you do? It's not the same thing. So, by operating and being aware of the effect of the genre layer, we can then back away from the specifically detailed injury, gloss over the broken fingers, the broken orbitals, the smashed noses, the lost teeth, and all the things that are extremely fun in a different expression of the genre, or in a different genre altogether. So we can have that fun Indiana Jones getting beaten up, yet still able to go, because the system is never going to be called upon to bring about those injuries, right? Or we're going to choose to play a system that doesn't deliver that kind of information, so we don't have to ignore it. That kind of thing. All right, that's a much shorter and much simpler example 2. It probably should have been example 1. So this next segment is really about communication. It's about interaction inside the playgroup, not with the hobby at large, not writ large in letters of fire across the blogosphere or through circles of podcaster followings and interactions. None of that stuff. Just conversation with the people that you're actually going to play with when you sit down. And we've got the much lauded session 0, and we're going to talk about how we're going to play. Well, there's more to it than that, I think. If we are true to our terminology, then session 0 is how we're going to play this game this time. All right, we're going to talk about characters. We're going to talk about the environment of play. We're going to talk about genre and genre expectations and that sort of thing. We might double check what specific requirements people might have in terms of things that they're working through, and being kind and whatnot to each other, because we're playing ostensibly with friends or people that we imagine could be friends, right? So we talk about all the things like where we're going to play and at what time we're going to play and what should we do in case of cancellation, and what kind of characters are and are not acceptable this time, and so on and so forth, right? We get into the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty of play. But there are conversations that need to happen after that about how the play experience is actually working out for us. There are conversations about our previous experiences with this particular game system or this particular genre or these types of characters or this type of pitch, right? From before, and our expectations for what that might be like now with this group. Any concerns that we might have or any positives that we're looking forward to. And through all of these different types of conversations, no one conversation can rule them all. Things change. The reality and our perception of what that reality is going to be like in the future when it happens, they don't always, or perhaps almost never, perfectly align. And so, one conversation leads to other conversations. So in my culture of play, with the people that I play with, we have pre-game discussions, and we have recaps pre and post session. We have rules discussions about things that we've talked about during the week between sessions. We have rule discussions immediately at the end of play when some new interaction with the game or with the genre or with characters or whatever has come up. We talk about it, and we don't let things fester if at all possible. But none of this conscientious gaming, none of this paying attention to the experience of play can exactly protect us or maybe even prepare us for not understanding the other people at the table. There are conversations that we have, there are terms that we can use, there are situations that we can be in where we have the conversation, everybody's communicating with everybody else in good faith, and yet our meanings pass by without registering. We make an incorrect assumption about what the other person meant through no fault of our own and no fault of their own, just our experiences don't quite align. And I don't have a lot of good examples of this, but I have some. And one, and I hate to keep referring you to the YouTube channel, but at the same time, I'd like you to be able to independently confirm what it is that I'm sharing. At the same time, there are experiences which can be observed or can be shown and can't quite be distilled down into a podcast relation of events. But I'm going to try. So, when we decided to publicly play a Powered by the Apocalypse game, we chose a cyberpunk one of the early cyberpunk PBTA games. This was called The Veil. So we decided to play The Veil with 3 game masters in a kind of a round-robin situation. And we had a formal session 0 where we identified that we wanted to have 3 game masters, or 3 MCs, to use the parlance of that game. We wanted to have 3 sessions each for a total of 9 sessions, and then that would end that initial foray into sharing that genre together as a new group and sharing that iteration of that system together as 3 game masters. And then we would decide what we were going to do from there, how the exploration would or would not continue. So in that trio, my turn came up last. So I got to have the most consistent presentation or experience of character throughout. I had 6 straight sessions where all I had to do was show up and play my character. And then I had 3 sessions where I got to be the MC. The duty that fell on me was to facilitate the end of this 9-session arc, right, to use a story term. And because it's powered by the apocalypse, it's pretty hard to escape what I call the story layer. Right? Now, the first game master, right, had a similar experience in that he also got to run a character through 6 sessions straight, but these were sessions 4 through 9, and his character started out being represented to us kind of distantly as an NPC. And so a little different than just walking into the imagined environment as your character and starting to relate and put everything together from that perspective. He had to present the perspective of the setting that we were using and then enter into it later, kind of wondering how the switch in Game Master might change it. Now, what makes this particular experiment relevant and interesting for this example and this episode is that the Game Masters approached play differently. So the first game master in the set, and you can go and you can observe this for yourself, the first game master in the set chose, for one reason or another, to operate completely on the story layer. Decisions were made because of how they created story, how they challenged characters as characters in a story, how they were moves to affect the narrative. The second game master tried to facilitate an in-character experience from the point of view of using the mechanisms provided by that system to provide it. So trying not to operate on the story layer. The third game master, me, also wanted to provide an in-character experience. But by this point, clearly recognized that that was unlikely to happen because of the nature of play with the system and the mix of players and game masters involved. And so I chose to operate as the MC on the story layer, sort of. Mostly I tried to operate on the genre layer. What pushed me into the story layer was that I was bringing these 9 sessions to an end, or not exactly bringing them to an end, but not keeping them going, right? Allowing things to play out and be done, right? It's a pretty different approach from the first game master and the second game master. So we had 3 very different approaches to play, operating on varying of what I call layers, and that's why this stands as an example, right? Operating on various layers, seeing the layers differently, being interested in and attracted to different layers and combinations of layers, right? We were not all eating or serving the same cake. So you can see all of these sessions, you can see all of the discussions that go into these sessions, and you can see our reflections on those sections, all in their own playlist called The Veil Actual Play on the YouTube channel. But if you're not able or interested in doing that, the explanation that you've just suffered through or survived should suffice as an example of the utility of layers. Because what we did not talk about, partly because I didn't think it was necessary with this particular group, which was proven to be false, and partly because it got really interesting to see the effect of not talking about it would have. So it's kind of interesting. So we, in our discussions in the actual play playlist, talk about our feelings. We talk about how the feeling of playing the game and our expectations about what we want out of that use of time work with and jar with our play, and how we feel we are doing things well for us and how we think we are doing things poorly for the game, or areas where we think that the game needs some work, and that sort of thing. It's a pretty broad discussion where we try to bring up as much as we can about our experience for the benefit of the other people playing the game. So the last part of how it's relevant is about the experience of play is as an example of of 3 different players trying to find common ground. And, 2 of the players did definitely find common ground, and 1 of the players, not so much. And that's okay. Right? We're all still friends. We all still talk games and gaming. But we will be more particular in the future about what games we play together so as to minimize the potential for dissatisfaction. Right? And I think that's a really important skill to have, particularly if you don't have a stable group, or if you have a huge group, or if you have groups of groups, or if you're one of those people who play mostly with strangers in conventions and that sort of thing. I think it's valuable to understand the different experiences that people can have, the different experiences that people can value or will accept, and ways to get there, or conversely, ways to avoid them if they're a problem. I wasn't going to talk about this, but I think I've changed my mind. And maybe this is the best place to kind of insert this segment out of time and space from the recording of the other parts. Terminology. A couple of days ago, on a great episode of The Random Screed, an episode called Call in Catsup, the host, Jason Hobbs, kind of lamented the fact that we as gamers, one, do not have our own internal set of jargon and terminology to talk about our own internal goings-on in the state of play. We have a lot of borrowed terminology from literature or literature criticism, or from film and that sort of thing, from other disciplines or from other hobbies and other arts. We have remarkably little discourse and terminology about what we do from the perspective of what we do, in the context of what we do, from the people who are actually doing it, if you know what I mean. And wouldn't it be great if we did have a set of terms with stable meanings that we could all make use of if we are the sort who care to talk about how games work, how experiences feel, why certain methods and certain combinations of methods and rules and certain combinations of methods and rules and procedures, and how we choose to speak to each other. So in other words, approaches to play, how all of those things combine to produce or enhance or detract from specific experiences. So it becomes much easier to, say, label or identify a game, or to buy a new game and look at some, author's forward or something, or designer's forward that says, I put this game together to try and maximize the chance that you'll be able to reach this experience. And then you can say, I'm not interested in that experience, so maybe I won't buy this game, or I'm not interested in that experience, but I think I can twist this game to my will by doing these other procedures that I've identified and know how to do, and that sort of stuff. I think there'd be a lot of utility in that. And so I'm right there with him, lamenting the fact that we don't really have a stable lexicon of terms to use. And the evidence for this is all over the internet. There are lots of signature words that we hear a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, you can sort of hear that these are things that have an assumed meaning, and there is no place to go to really look up a quote official meaning, and there's no kind of authority or council of elders or whatever to assign that stable meaning. As a hobby, there simply hasn't been enough time. The hobby itself isn't mature enough, isn't old enough to have established these patterns and have established a lexicon that's, in a sense, learned by proxy and learned by exposure, and that still retains the same sense. We see the sense drift through each generation of gamers to the point where people will take a term in completely baffling directions from the perspective of the person who has used the term. So, yeah, it would be great if we had that stable lexicon. At the same time, I'm hesitant about being involved with, or, being a kind of Ambrose Bierce and brewing a devil's dictionary of terms for, mass consumption. And my fear is what I was talking about in a previous episode, which is that when we do settle on terms, it has, I'm fumbling for the right word here, ironically, it has a limiting or controlling effect on how we think. And because I feel like we're still in very much of an exploratory phase with role-playing games, that we're still having, almost 50 years in, we're still having year one conversations, right? The hobby as a whole, whatever community we have as a hobby, is still endlessly circling around the conversations that the hobby, in its much smaller, brand newer form, was having in its first year or years of existence. New people come in, they have play experiences. Some people care to consider those play experiences. Some people find like-minded individuals to talk about those play experiences with, and they have similar revelations. And that's what we talk about. But the hobby itself hasn't really moved beyond that. And there, of course, have been efforts, right? There are game design courses at the university level. There are huge design communities where people talk about how their designs affect play or are intended to affect play. But these are pockets, and the conversations are ephemeral, and they are, in a sense, at odds with each other, and many of them come laden with agendas that go beyond communicating clearly about a design or about a procedure or a methodology or an experience of play. And gamers being gamers, with that hint maybe of competition, there are pushes to be right and to combat types of play that we don't like, and to assign positive value to the things that we like and assign negative value to things that we don't like. And we'll say, that game mechanism, that way that you roll dice, or that way that you draw cards, or the way that you spend those meta currency points, I don't like them, therefore they are bad. Which, it has absolutely no value whatsoever outside of your own personal circle of people that you are going to play with. They don't really matter in any substantive way to the group of people in the hobby at large. As much as you value your own opinion, sadly, it does not carry universal weight. You will encounter just as many people who have the opposite opinion as you, and it's just an opinion. There's no scientifically proven to be a better way to play, sadly or not. So this is the sort of thinking that gives me pause about this. So we've got this tremendous value of having a stable lexicon, and yet we have this sort of current condition of the hobby. And until more experienced gamers are able to start recording their experiences in books that are readable and connect with large numbers of gamers, right? Representative of the things that we did, representative of the things that we were interested in. Books like Playing at the World or The Elusive Shift by John Peterson. Books that do more than just recount the history of what Gary Gygax did or purportedly said or where he went, but look instead at what people remember about their play experiences, how they played, why they chose to play that way, who they played with, and how that changed what they were doing as players. The arguments and discussions that they had as a result of play, and what came out of those discussions. What games came next? How were they different? What did they feel like? What did people try and then abandon? What did people innovate independently, separately, in response to similar perceptions of problem, and so on and so forth? Until we can get enough of this out there so that future designers, by association with actually playing games in the hobby, are likely to read them and absorb them and recognize themselves in them, and so recognize that those thoughts and ideas and theories and suggestions and advice are simply, in large measure, not present in our game materials, and therefore are never being communicated to other gamers. It means that we are continually reinventing the wheel, unless that particular gamer, it goes on a particular quest to read blogs or go to conventions and talk to people or listen to podcasts or watch YouTube or whatever. Right? The conversations live and die in our own tiny silos of friendship. So it's a multi-step process before the hobby reaches a certain level of maturity where its own wisdom about itself is regularly being communicated in a digestible form to its newcomers, who then will take it a step farther, instead of what we have now, which is kind of a cyclical reinvention of the same old stuff. Once we reach that hypothetical stance, where we're no longer just circling the drain of year one, I think that is the time when a stable lexicon can be developed. And who knows? We might even be alive when that happens. Okay, my thanks go out to the various people who inspired me to record and process and release this episode, or who, through their interaction, kind of shaped the information presented in it. You know who you are, but other people don't. So I'd like to thank, of course, Che Webster, who is featured quite prominently in this episode. I'd like to thank Jason Connerly for the gentle reminders to post and the continual calls to action through his own podcast for contests and things like that, and his great support of the forthcoming RPG a Day due in August. There'll be an episode about that soon. But if you can't wait, you can find an episode all about it on the YouTube channel, youtube.com/runeslinger. I'd also like to thank Primeval Fantasy, who I communicate with on Twitter, for encouraging parts of this episode and parts of a forthcoming episode to take shape about communication at the table about all of this stuff. And I would be remiss if I did not mention Jason Hobbs at Random Screed, whose back catalog I've begun to dig into recently, and that's motivating me to keep going and get back into the action. And his recent posts, which I've been finding very interesting and enjoyable, and aligned with things that I want to explore and talk about too. And last but not least, for this episode, Joe Richter, whose positivity and his presence on Discord, and his presence on Twitter and that sort of stuff, putting a like here and a comment there, just helps make everything feel more like community. Sanity tells us that this really should be the end of this episode, so I will leave you with a brief teaser about next episode, where I sit down with my friend and fellow gamer from the other side of the world, someone that I haven't met in person, and yet I have explored countless worlds with, in character, as character, and in other ways. Next episode, we'll have a talk with Eloy Centron, who will share with us a very practical, hands-on example about all the stuff that we've been talking about, focused in on a game that's near and dear to many of my listeners, Dungeons and Dragons.
It's that when you're trying to produce the story, right? So it's how can I get my character in trouble? And so that's antithetical to I'm the character. So I don't want to bring trouble onto me. I want to get myself out of trouble, right? And so it's antithetical. That's another spectrum thing. It's like, can you walk the middle path?
The middle path is I'm willing to get into the right kind of trouble.
Right. That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. But I don't know. It's hard to figure. You just go from in-character layer, then you pull completely out to director layer, and let's have this bad thing happen to them. And then you sort of go back in and, oh no, this bad thing happened to me.
And it feels fake.
I wonder why. Yeah, and then it feels inauthentic, right? And that's this dissonance in there.
It feels inauthentic to us.
Right, and because there's dissonance there, it's like, wait a minute.
If you can't or don't want to wait for more of Eloy Centron, otherwise known on YouTube as Umbramancer, well, go to YouTube. His channel is Umbramancer, all one word, and you'll find videos on this topic and others, which you might enjoy. In fact, I'm pretty sure you will. You've been listening to another episode of the Casting Shadows podcast. Once a podcast on Anchor, now a podcast on Spotify. If anything that has happened in this episode has sparked your interest and your desire to communicate, well, there are numerous ways to do so, and they're outlined in the show notes. But in brief, you can try to contact us through Spotify. That will either work or not. You can contact us through SpeakPipe at www.speakpipe.com/Casting Shadows podcast. And you can leave a 90-second message or multiples of 90-second messages there. Or you can get a hold of me via Discord or Twitter or Facebook or YouTube by looking for me at Runeslinger. Pretty easy. So I look forward to speaking with you about role-playing game topics somehow, some way, in the near future. But until the next time, take care.